Welcome back, everybody. This is Group B doing our presentation over Christopher Newfield's book, The Great Mistake. This was a signed reading. We just had a short section from this book about how we wrecked public universities and how we can fix them. So our group came up with a couple of slides to kind of help us talk through this, and then we've got some discussion questions at the end for you all and possibly us as well to ponder and sort of talk our way through. So we'll go ahead and get started and hope you enjoy our conversation. All right, so Christopher Newfield is a professor in the Department of English at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and you can see his research interests there. He has a public blog that he still updates pretty frequently, so you can check that out if you're interested in some of his ongoing work. And he's somewhat active on Twitter as well, definitely kind of presenting a little bit of an unusual argument, looking at both the history of higher ed and kind of the economic reality of where we are right now within our new normal. This is even pre-COVID, new normal of higher education. And as you read about, lots of concerns that he brings up about where we go next.
I'm happy to jump in here. So you will kind of see that we'll be touching on a lot of the same points throughout our discussion. Really talking about like this idea of the great mistake and where kind of higher education took this turn for the worse, and what it has looked like over the last couple decades and where we have come to find ourselves now. And we'll have some discussion questions that we're going to talk about as a group and that we would encourage you all to talk about at the end. But one of the things that is discussed is this American funding model. And I don't think I need to go into much detail because I think we're all experiencing this, right? Like there's this new low public funding that public institutions in higher education are getting, but yet so that's creating higher tuition for students, which then is creating this high student debt that not only students are incurring, but then their parents are incurring as well through like this parental plus loans. And then so that's creating lower access to college, to colleges, and then lower attainment into the institutions. So that's what we're seeing public institutions of higher education looking like right now. Which was obviously not the original intent and mission when higher education was originally created.
You know, I think it was really interesting how he kind of walked us through this pattern through the lens of a parent, of a student. I thought that was a really interesting overview because obviously it was not, based on a true experience of what a parent might be doing, or like, oh, so you decided to read this study that showed you about, other issues within higher education. But I do think it's understandable that from a parent's perspective, when they're just sort of hoping that education is the answer for their kids, the way maybe it was for them, that there's just a real frustration at what is being presented. And so I think it was interesting the way that he tried to humanize that problem.
Lauren, so my son just finished his freshman year, and although he goes to high university now, so we have a tuition benefit, which,
Yeah.
I mean, so thankful for that, but he initially went somewhere else. He wanted to play college sports, and the opportunities that were afforded to him, the cost was astronomical. And so initially, as I was reading through that parent perspective, like I completely was right there with the author as he took us through that. Just, as my son initially, we were going to support his opportunities elsewhere. And then, because he wanted the opportunity, to play college sports, but, it really, and also looking at a lot of his friends who didn't have the opportunities that we have. So first of all, even looking at things like having people walk you through financial aid processes and things like that. I
Yeah.
mean, I still, filling out the FAFSA is a super challenge
Yeah.
for my husband and I each year.
Mhm.
And you would think that, you know, given that it wouldn't have been as challenging, but
Mhm.
just thinking about some of his friends and some others who maybe don't have those supports. And so like just those issues of equity too that the author addressed really kind of hit home in our own
Yeah.
experience as well. So
The one thing that I kept thinking about as I was reading this, one was that when it was talking about like this one family's experience and sending
Mhm.
their daughters to school, I was like, wow, he's really invested in this, like researching. I'm like, my parents, sorry to like call them out, but did none of this. Like I literally went
Mhm.
in, we filled out financial aid, they took out these loans. I didn't know, like when I got this refund check back, that we should probably put that aside, and blew it all. And so first I was thinking, good for these parents, because he makes a quote in here, not a quote. He talks about like, it is time that parents and students start pulling their heads out of the sand and really start um, pushing for the system of public higher education to change if we want a middle
Yeah.
class to exist. And, you know, just
Yeah.
this past weekend, I was having conversations with friends and we were like determining, like, are we like what class are we actually? And a lot of it was determined because of our school debt that we have.
Yeah.
And it's just funny, like, if we want this middle class to continue, we have to get higher education back to the way that it was originally, without this high student debt, with higher access for students, with tuition to be brought down. And so it's something that like we all have a responsibility to continue these conversations and to really push for it.
Hmm.
I have the same line of thinking. I think about first generation students and
Yeah.
just being able to navigate the system. So even when he's calling for the public to get their head out of the sand, how much of the public actually doesn't have the level of experience or knowledge about how the system is functioning, let alone putting a college student through their education to even be able to have that type of the type of conversation or that type of change on a broader society level, which I think was kind of the big crux of this, was shifting back and acknowledging the public good of higher education as opposed to the private values.
Yeah, and you know, his blog is kind of interesting in that he takes that argument further and actually calls out how we're funding community colleges, which he didn't reference much in this piece, but on his blog he talks about how the way that community colleges are funded and the fact that they can't charge higher tuition the way that other places can to make up the deficit for that. He just calls it out as a racist issue, and that, you know, when we think about who community colleges traditionally serve, that you know, that it's a systemic racist institutionalism that is allowing the funding model to just be what it is. So I thought that was really interesting, because I think he hints around that a little bit in this piece, but really, you know, is taking the argument further even today.
Yeah, so he and I'll jump into this first part here. So it talked about like these false claims that I think we've just become so accustomed to believing, the way that like society has pushed how public education should be, that like we should just expect tuition hikes to happen, right? And he's
Mm-hmm.
saying that like it doesn't need to be that way. And that financial aid takes care of all student needs, because that's not actually so. Like even after you fill out the FAFSA, you do all these things. Like there's this one family talked about still having, I think, like a $9,200 gap that they had to pay. And that public funding cuts haven't damaged the educational core, because clearly they absolutely have. So these were the false claims that he began to discuss, which really fed into this idea of where this great mistake came from. And that's that we, like I have to say all of us, that people aren't fighting to hang on to this low cost public colleges,
Mm-hmm.
that we're pushing towards these like expensive private Ivy League or semi-Ivy League research institutions rather than really fighting for the low-cost public institutions.
I think it's interesting too that with an economics background, he's arguing that we need to spend more on public universities. I mean, that's such a refreshing but also unique argument from so many different angles. And so I think it's really telling that he's calling out these things that I think even as faculty and as staff, we just come to like accept, like, yeah, well, we've been underfunded, and yeah, well, that's just the way it is. Nobody, cares about education. We're going to have a bake sale to try to raise profits. And so, I did find it refreshing that he really makes an argument that we need to be spending even more than we currently are.
I thought it was interesting too, the way he talked about the fact that government doesn't support, especially state governments don't support higher education like they once did. But the issue is framed in that even if the government isn't directly supporting higher education through state share of instruction or whatever, the costs that are incurred by the government because of the issues around student debt. I mean, if you think like just how economically delayed college graduates are now, they can't afford to live on their own, they can't afford to buy homes, buy cars. I mean, the economy shoulders a lot of that burden kind of in indirect ways. That it's an interesting way to frame. I thought it was an interesting way to frame it, and that no matter what the government is paying, rather it's on the front end by just providing direct support or paying on the back end through, not realizing a lot of the economic potential that should come from a well-educated workforce, college-educated workforce that's, ready to go, prepared for jobs and to go out and work. So I just thought that was an interesting way to look at it, because we're paying the costs. It's just like on the front end or on the back end. And I think it's easy for, politicians especially to be sort of short-sighted and more willing to, appease their constituencies in the moment by cutting the costs when, really long-term is that as beneficial as they make it seem.
Yeah.
Well, and that whole conversation too about, like, I think they said from the like 40s to the mid 70s that higher education, you went to college and then you were going to make enough money that, but then that shift kind of started happening in the mid 70s where, you're going to college wasn't going to assure you that you were going to get a better paying job. And so just that whole shift as well. I thought was really interesting, the timing of when they thought that would happen, So I can, in terms of like the next slide, the decline of state appropriations, burden shifting from society to students, that whole conversation I thought was really fascinating too, particularly when we talk about the efficiency practices, thinking, okay, we're just going to figure out more efficient ways to deliver instruction. So from the faculty perspective, I'm always on the peripheral of a lot of these conversations. I'm a faculty position, but yet I'm more of an administrative role right now because as a center director. And so those conversations, particularly in my field, when we're like saying, okay, we can put more students in a class, right? And what's the impact of that for faculty? When they're trying to prepare candidate, if we got junior and senior level candidates that need really specialized types of skills, and then you're going to say, well, we'll just put you in a big room and then you'll have twice or three times as many students. Or the whole increase on contingent faculty as well, from the standpoint of, that's actually what I wrote. That's one of the focus of one of my papers, is how we're switching from tenure track full-time faculty to more adjunct and contingent
Mhm.
faculty and part-time faculty, and what that means, because those faculty were not giving as much support as well. So what is the impact of that on instruction, right? When we're saying, okay, we're going to hire a bunch of part-time people, but are we really supporting them, that the students are getting the best opportunities too? So I thought that part was really interesting when I was looking at it. Or just the impact on research and faculty feeling like they don't have autonomy there, that it's more about those partnerships with maybe corporations, or as you're looking for grant funding, needing to fit something into a very narrow path, as opposed to, you know, the whole thought that research, you know, for the greater good, that it you know, kind of looking at that. And just that productivity
Mm.
and income you know, like, you used to be, you went to college, you knew you were going to be afforded, you know, increased compensation, and you were going to be able to say, well, this is the kind of life that I want. And then we have more and more students that are graduating, like I said, we've said before, with, you know, incredible student debt, and the whole issue of equity around that, right?
Yep.
If I'm a student who's my parents can pay out of pocket for me to go to a school, as opposed to someone who is going to be reliant on, it really makes that whole equity you know, parameters even larger when we talk about higher education. So I thought that was extremely depressing to read about that.
I think it has also created a lot of generational strife, right? So like we've had, you know, businesses have kept wages pretty consistent and stable, even as higher education costs have skyrocketed. And so, you know, I have superiors who are talking about, ha ha ha, in a couple of years I'll be retired and it'll be your problem. But no, it'll really be my problem. And my wage isn't growing to the same extent that theirs was. And the debt that I incurred isn't anywhere near what they incurred when they went to college. And so it's just been really frustrating for me. And I know for people younger than I, that they're really angry about that trade-off. And I think a lot of that leads to some folks that maybe would have considered college sort of thinking like, well, I'm not going because it's not even going to help me in the long run. Right? That there's not that return on investment that will automatically be there. And I think some of that is the shifting, you know, nature of work, but I think some of that too is just kind of this grief that we're seeing young people graduate with tons of debt and go into jobs that haven't seen a salary bump, you know, since pre the Great Recession, and the cost of living just hasn't kept up with it. So it's left me feeling a little bleak during this time frame as state budgets get cut even more. And I think about the people graduating now and what they're graduating into, because it's hard to come back from that.
You
I
know,
mean, that's why, oh, sorry. I
oh,
was just gonna say, like, that's
go ahead.
why you think about, like, so I went to a public liberal arts state school, and I majored in journalism with like an emphasis. I wanted to do print journalism. Clearly that's like pretty much dead. But I knew that when I graduated, I'm like, what am I going to do with this? Like, was I even set up for success? So that's why I went and got my master's. But then I think like now where things are going, like even the generation now, or like our children coming up, like, are they going to be better suited for a technical school or these certificates that are being offered, because they're actually getting something that's preparing them in an industry. Because I didn't feel prepared, and now I'm like, is my master's, like, it's gotten me to where I am now, but I feel like if I want to even move up now, I need a PhD. Like, where does it stop? I don't know.
Well, and that's where, like, as the community college person, I'll just say, like, we kind of feel like there's a moment for us to shine, right? Like, not to depress you, but we just had a high school graduate who took a bunch of IT courses, and he graduated high school, applied for 3 different jobs, got all 3 offers, and is making $50,000 because of what he took in high school. And, you know, he's on track. He might choose to get a 4-year degree, but he might not, because he doesn't need it in that industry. And that was not even on my radar, something like that when I was in high school, you know. And we've got a partnership with Honda where same sort of thing. People are graduating with a 2-year degree making 80,000. And it's like, there are other options, but as a society, we see 4-year degree. Or when we talk about colleges, we see Harvard, right? Like today, it made the news that Harvard has called it for online schooling this fall. We called it a long time ago for online schooling this fall, but now everybody's talking about it because Harvard did it. And so I do think that there is a moment for community colleges to share their value proposition. But as a lover of liberal arts, I will also say I do have concerns over what does that mean, right? If we're just fast tracking students into careers and they're not getting the breadth of experience, then, you know, how do we ensure that educated citizenry in lots of different ways? Because I think economic gain is only one facet of what you get from a college degree.
Yeah, I think the nature of the way we're talking about this is exactly somewhat of his point of that it's been viewed purely as an economic decision. What's going to give me the highest return on? And shifting to this slide, I think maybe starting at the bottom with redefining what it means to be an educated person.
Yes.
That's exactly what he was talking about. It's gone truly to students being a driver of the economy, and maybe ignoring or not putting as much emphasis on the other benefits of higher education, to be happier, things that finding more meaning in one's life, those types of things. And so with this slide, the 5 dimensions, talking about that, the bottom one, but we've already talked about the cost shifts from society to students, the lower public funding, shifting that into student loans and student debt and putting that burden on them and increasing the inequities. Outsourcing to for-profit vendors. I think we see that a lot in certainly housing and culinary type of situations. Typically costs the university money and puts the revenues in those for-profit vendors' pockets mostly. Shifting government control to private funders. I think that was mostly about with the reductions in public funding, universities going after whether it's corporate or just private donors and them having increased influence on the operations of the university, but also research and the direction of academics as a whole. And then the changing the mission of higher ed. I think that was kind of geared more towards dismissing the public good aspect of it and the value that it plays to society overall, and going again back to more of purely an economic and a career kind of preparation approach to higher education. Open that up to others to comment.
I just think like and this is a very general statement, but I was watching on Hulu, I think it was today, like the college admissions scandal documentary, and just talking about like the, you know, obviously the really wealthy being able to pay that key foundation or whatever. And I just think like, wow, that is a very specific case with individuals. Like we're turning to that in higher education generally. Like this is a place for the wealthy. And that's why we're shifting away from this idea of middle class. Like how far does it need to go that we're just like setting the true success up for people that have money? Like, again, you said people are paying attention because it's Harvard. But, you know, people are paying attention, or schools are getting these huge endowments, or these huge philanthropists that are contributing tons and tons of money. Yes, they are contributing research, but it's mostly because that's where the money is at. And so I just like wonder where is it going to be in 10, 15, 20 years? I just don't see there's not too much of a difference as one family putting all this money in to get their son or daughter into college than what is happening on a larger scale. I don't know if that makes sense, but I was sitting there and I'm like, this isn't much different. Companies are doing this right now.
Yeah. So yeah, companies are doing this right now, right? I mean, that's a pretty a pretty good tradition or transition. It just seems like just going back to my generational comment, you know, students who graduate with these degrees are hungry for their first jobs, hungry to get into that economy, and aren't really in a position to say no, even though the wages have been stagnant for a long time. And so part of why the, you know, increased tuition hasn't been tolerable is that there just hasn't been that increase in wages to go with it. So you have one cost going up and the other kind of just flatlining, and then you have housing costs going up. And again, I'm just going to bring up generational strife, right? Like the whole OK Boomer movement, I think was in part a little bit of frustration that, like, all right, you know, there are folks who are not retiring from the workforce because now is not a good time to retire. But they've had a very different experience in the workforce than young people today. And so, you know, I will say, at least on behalf of my little micro generation, that it's a frustrating time. And, you know, to your point about staying middle class or being middle class, it feels really hard to make the ends meet. Even with as much privilege as I feel like, you know, I have, or, you know, those of us working in higher ed have, it's frustrating.
We had a discussion about this, actually, a fun little family discussion over the holiday weekend about, I think it was Target just announced that they're taking all employees to a like bottom $15 an hour minimum wage, and how you know, eventually it'll get to a point where, you know, there will be jobs like that that actually pay wages that are fairly comparable to jobs that companies are requiring a 4-year degree for, you know, people to be hired into. And, you know, then what will that do for the value of a bachelor's degree? And the person that I was having the conversation with was sort of, you know, like, well, no one wants to go work at Target as a career, right? Like, that's not what people aspire to do. And so why should they be paid a living wage in order to be able to do that? But I think where the blame should lie is with the companies who are not paying fair wages, you know, fair market wages for people who do have bachelor's degrees and master's degrees. Because if if everyone starts off a little bit higher, then things will level out. But I think we just, you know, economically, we find ourselves in an odd time right now where things are kind of flipping the script. I have a very close friend who just graduated with a doctorate in physical therapy, and she's can't find a job and is waitressing this summer, and is likely making more as a waitress in kind of like an upscale sort of touristy kind of restaurant location. She's likely making more than what she'll be making as an entry-level physical therapist with a doctorate. So it's definitely like the balance isn't there, but like where I think different people have different interpretations of where we place the blame. And I mean, to Lauren's point, like it's something that our generation is likely going to feel the effects of as we try to figure out like how to live and maintain our life.
Yeah, which I mean, I think, you know, I thought this image was funny. Whoever put this on here, Marcy, I don't know if it was you or if Lauren, it was you, but like, I mean, it really does. Like, it feels like this, and the educational quality has suffered, and it's hurting public higher education, and it's hurting students too. So this image was really, really good. Which kind of like takes us into like where where we're at now, and we'll get into this a little bit deeper as we do some discussion questions at the end. But you know, it's proven students actually need more hands-on instruction, but universities are transitioning to less by
Yeah.
using online education. Obviously, in the time that we're in now, some of that is we have no other option. But even before COVID, universities were moving to this so that they could get more people in the classrooms and fill more seats, and just be able to get more people in the doors, and that this is a cheaper way of instruction. So, you know, clearly it's taken in effect because students would say that they're not getting the same type of education and learning that they would have if they were in the classroom and getting like one-to-one professor feedback and support.
Yeah. And when I think about my undergrad experience, I mean, the things that taught me the most were the one-on-one interactions that I had with faculty members and with my advisor. And, you know, it seems unfair that, that I was able to have that, and that's not something that is available in a lot of places. And I think this whole idea of MOOC is such a businessy sort of privatization type of model, right? And at our school, it's kind of a running joke now, like, oh, I smell a MOOC coming, like whenever there's some sort of idea floated out there that this sounds too good to be true and or too businessy to be about students, because they think this just took away all of that personalization. And really you saw entrance in the field from people who don't know anything about education, or higher education at least, but they were trying to, you know, position themselves in such a way that they could get people there faster, cheaper, but really not with the quality, nor the success rates that would be expected elsewhere.
Yeah. And, you know, this also makes me think, I had an experience much like you, Lauren, that, you know, when I was an undergrad, I spent a lot of time with my advisor. My class sizes were relatively small. We
Yeah.
kind of learned and grew together. And just thinking about, I was in a meeting not too long ago about, okay, what, and this is prior to the pandemic, but okay, what can we do online? And I was sitting there thinking, I have a nephew who took public speaking online, and I just remember thinking, wow, I mean, we're at a place where even courses like public speaking, you know, we're saying, yeah, we can do that online. And that was a course that I remember as a freshman was huge for me, as somebody who was very anxious about talking in front of people and actually having people that I was looking at when I was talking to. And so, you know, just being worried. And two, post-pandemic, what is this kind of showing us? We've had to create structures where this is the normal. And so when we come out on the other side, what is this going to mean in terms of the shift of, you know, how coursework is going to be delivered? If we've kind of shown because we had to, yeah, I guess we can be efficient and do everything in a different way.
Mm-hmm.
You know, what's going to happen afterwards? I think I find myself thinking about that a lot, particularly because I work in teacher preparation. So I'm like, we're preparing teachers. We're already trying to figure out how to prepare them when they're not actually going to be in schools, right? And are we finding ways to, I don't know, that's something that keeps me up at night.
Yeah. Yeah. I think this is just a good graphic to kind of see the cycle that is happening and continuing to happen. And I think, you know, one thing that we talked about ahead of time when we were, you know, messaging back and forth about this is like, what now, to Marcy's point, in this time of COVID, like what will that do, especially as state budgets are getting cut by, you know, 20%, possibly more. What does that end up looking like?
So we have a little bit less than 5 minutes left. So do we want to just kind of talk briefly about some of these questions? And then I think that they would be good for everybody else as you're kind of wrapping up this video to kind of think about and leave you with before we enter into class. Does that sound good? So the first one was, Newfield's argument focuses on four-year schools, but the trends he discusses impacts all institutions of higher education. Are there differences in how he discusses that impact different schools?
I think just sort of taking a look at HBCUs and community colleges and, other types of institutions, again, I was interested in his take on some other things because I couldn't quite get a full read on him from this piece. And so that's where I found his blog and his Twitter feed a little bit more inclusive of some other places. But I do think that, particularly with that rising tuition, that is a real difference that four-year schools have that, a community college would not have access to.
And then how does the current situation exacerbate the problems Newfield discusses?
It's not good. It's not good.
But he suggests that there is good news.
So I mean, folks, I was really depressed reading this. Like,
Yeah.
I was already a little blue after the governor's announcement about K-12 last week, and pray for us, parents. But like, yeah, I was reading this like, everything's awful. So did you all see more hope, or maybe the rest of his book gives that further hope?
I just kept thinking at the end when he was like, there is good news, there are things we could do. I had trouble seeing how that was going to be reversed. That I feel like we're almost so far down the rabbit hole that I did not feel hopeful, but that I wondered the same thing. Well, I wonder if the rest of his book, if I would feel better if I read the whole thing.
Right.
I also thought it was kind of interesting when he talked about the bipartisanship part in it and how different, political parties viewed the, I mean, I found that to be interesting and frustrating as well. But
I thought about kind of one of the things I've been thinking about with just this current situation is some of those schools that have made that decision to go online fully, and us currently trying to play this game of we're coming back, but there's 1,500 different scenarios that we're trying to prepare for. One of the, thoughts I had around those is like, how much time and energy is being put towards the multiple scenarios, and those schools that have already made a decision that said we're going online and this is the way it's going to be,
Make it good.
The production, the capacity of staff right now, they know the direction, they know where they're headed. And there's at some point in this article that he talked about or made the comment that universities have lost their direction and lost their clear message about being a public good. And I kind of paralleled that to, I feel like that's the way we are right now in this current situation. We don't have a clear direction to put all of our energy towards whatever that direction is. So we're kind of left muddling in these different things, going after different corporate partnerships, different privatization, different aspects, just to feel like we're staying afloat. So that's been the parallel in our current situation. I think the way it relates to even this article.
Yeah, I've often said in meetings I've been having over the last couple of weeks, I feel like we're building a plane while it's flying and we have no idea where it's going. And so we're just kind of spinning our wheels when ultimately it's just gonna, potentially it's just gonna be like, all right, this is how it is. And so we spent a lot of time thinking about a lot of different things, and who knows how much of that will actually be useful, right? When it's all said and done. I don't know.
I think it's frustrating too, because I think, reading this, I think about, there's probably only really so much that can be done at an institutional level. In terms of our roles as administrators or even the leaders of our public institutions, I think like the amount of coordination that it would take, and if, one institution started to like buck the trend and go somewhere totally different, like I feel like, I don't know, in my day-to-day job, it feels like we do a lot of what we do based on trying to get to a certain number that looks better in rankings. And so it feels like a chase towards something where you're kind of left wondering, like, is this really doing Like, are we really doing what we should be doing? Or I work in fundraising, so I'm not like engaging with students, but I think it's the same way. Like, if Advancement's job is to engage meaningfully with alumni, to empower them to be involved in the institution and give back to their alma mater, like, we spend a lot of time just chasing numbers that at the end of the day don't really have, in my opinion, a whole lot of meaning. And so that can kind of be frustrating too. Like, it would take a lot of college and university presidents, or a lot of public university presidents, to all of a sudden stop caring about things like rankings, and those kinds of things to, be able to institute any kind of meaningful change. But it seems like there's always a pendulum shift, like maybe right now we're just kind of like at the top and we're like slowly making our way back down.
I just hope we're not like too far gone, that we're like too close to the business side of things and too far away from the original mission of higher education. Like, I want to have faith in this, and when he, wrapped this up, that there's good news. And I just think, I think the only way that can happen is if there is someone that's bold and does do a huge redesign, because clearly what is happening right now for schools like Ohio University and even in smaller state schools, smaller liberal arts, like, something needs to change, because we're just going to keep getting taken over by these schools that are operating like businesses. Like, we're just not going to win. And so something needs to happen, because it's just not working. So
Yeah. And I think the only way to get some of the folks who can make those changes to make them is the economic argument. So like Sarah, my alma mater, contacted me early on in March to be like, how are you doing? Are you okay? And that was like the extent of their reach out. But then I got a follow up probably just about a week ago that was like, if you can give, we understand if you can't, we still hope you're doing okay. But I was like, now that's pretty clever. And I was like, all right, here's some money. Because I was like, that's an effective. But I think when you make those shifts make sense on an economic value as well, then there are folks that buy into them. So maybe there is hope. I don't know.
Well, let's end on that note, because that felt good. Maybe there is hope. Yeah, well, hopefully these questions make everybody think a little bit, and that we didn't depress you all even further. But thank you for attending. And we will see everybody in class. Gonna try to record this and recording gracefully.
Thanks, Ariel. Thanks, guys.